Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast exploring the deep interconnections between personal wellness, societal challenges, and spiritual growth. Hosted by Dr. Jeff Armstrong, this thought-provoking series tackles the big questions. How do we cultivate a well-centered life in a world that often feels unbalanced? What role does spirituality play in solving today's personal and collective problems? Drawing from concepts of well-centered fitness, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social wellness, we bring you engaging conversations with experts, thinkers, and everyday people who challenge us to rethink our approaches to health, happiness, and harmony. Together, we uncover solutions to life's problems that start within. In this flagship episode, I am thrilled to be joined by Lauryn Axelrod, an interfaith and interspiritual leader and author of the book 10 Words, an interspiritual guide to becoming better people in a better world. As our world faces significant social, political, and personal challenges, Lauryn's guidance provides a fresh perspective and a path to inner peace and community betterment. Join us as we explore how we can each make a difference, beginning with ourselves. Today is the beginning of a new journey for me with the We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast. And my first guest is somebody who really inspired this tangent off of the Aging Well podcast. And I just want to start off with just welcoming Lauryn Axelrod to the podcast and start you off with a question. How would you describe your spiritual or philosophical perspective and how it shaped your worldview?
Wow, that's actually a really big question. I think I'll just speak from where I am right now, right? Because we're always on this journey. So, my spiritual understanding 10 years ago is different than my spiritual understanding now. So I'm just going to start with where I am now. My spiritual understanding is that whether you are aware of it or not, you are on a spiritual journey. And spirituality for me is about relationship. So it's the relationship that I have with myself, with others, with the world around me, and with whatever I call sacred. That relationship for me is the center of my life. Everything goes through that relationship, right? So how am I perceiving the sacred? How am I living through the sacred? For me, ultimately, the sacred is life itself. Life itself and the processes that create it. And there's an awe factor in that, right? What I call the wow factor. Like, it's just like, whoa, wow. And if we don't have a relationship to that which is greater, bigger, deeper, wider, however you want to perceive it, right? I perceive it as everywhere. So, and everything, it's massive, immense. I can't even conceive of it. But if I don't have a relationship to that, everything gets very small. Everything, this is where we lose a sense of purpose or meaning, and it becomes about getting the next eye gadget, that my relationship to that which I call sacred expands me. And that expansion then comes to include everything and everyone. So there is no separation anymore. There's no separation between me and you, me and my cat, me and the trees outside, me and the stars in the sky. So that sounds like a kind of convoluted answer, but yeah. It's really about my relationship to the sacred. It's the center of my life, and it's not small. It's expansive.
I think, and that's what I'm excited about for this podcast, is that I'm going to get slightly different answers for everybody, but I think at the end of it all, we're going to come to that same kind of realization that, spiritual is really just that there is something more than self, and yet self is included in everything. I will write universe with a capital U, because I believe it's something to be more than just, gazing out at the stars. It's every single molecule, every space between those molecules. Yeah. And a number of years ago, Rob Bell, who we attended his church when we lived in Michigan, and he did a whole tour on everything is spiritual. In fact, he did it twice, and
Mhm.
I encourage any of the listeners to just look up those videos. I think you can find them probably on YouTube or something like that now. But he goes from the smallest of the universe down to, and we haven't even figured that all out yet. From a quantum physics standpoint, we keep getting smaller and smaller, and yet you can go bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of that is what some of us might call God. Others might just consider, life itself. But there's something there that we're all searching for. And I'm
Right.
hoping that through this podcast, we'll be able to kind of find that a little bit.
Right. And I feel like really all of spirituality and really all of science to a certain degree really revolves around three questions. Who am I, or what am I? What's going on here? And how am I to live in relationship to that? Right?
Right.
So that image of scale, from the tiniest, like we can't even conceive of something smaller than a cork or whatever, to the immensity of the galaxy that we haven't even fully measured.
Yeah.
And what is it behind, underneath, throughout all of this that makes this exist? That's where you just go, whoa, I don't know. And for me, spirituality is also about sitting in that I don't know and being okay with that, because the truth is we're never going to know. We're on a need to know basis.
I think that's a point of consciousness and part of life itself, is that we are to explore that what we don't know. And there are writers out there that have talked about the whole purpose of creation, if you want to call it creation. I know some people might not like thinking of it that way, but even if you start from the Big Bang, process is bringing us to a point of mankind, a conscious being that is able to evolve into something greater and greater and becoming, I don't know what to call it. I don't want to say more human, because I feel like we're evolving beyond the humanity, to something much, much greater. And it's like, what is that we are supposed to become?
Yeah.
So.
And if we look at all of our faith and wisdom traditions, right, it is becoming more divine.
Yeah.
More like that which has manifested, created, from which all of the, existence has arisen. We hear all these words show up. They show up everywhere, right? And our trajectory could be to become more of our divine selves. And that's only going to come through a connection, a relationship to whatever it is that you call sacred, God, the Tao, source, ultimate reality, the great cheesecake. I really don't care what you call it, right?
Great cheesecake, okay.
There's some nuns near here that make holy cheesecake. So sometimes I do use the great cheesecake. But it doesn't matter what you call it. It's about your relationship to it, your connection to it.
Yeah, I've used the word God. I write it in the small caps, very similar, like, the Christian Bible will have Lord from the Old Testament capitalized. The whole concept is greater than what my mind can embrace right now, what I have learned in the variety of different denominations of Christianity that I have been through.
Right.
And I don't feel like we have all of the pieces. I mean, I can start thinking of, spirituality, or, what I would call God, to be something of a puzzle, that we're putting all these pieces together. And until we get all those pieces, you might look at the various traditions, the Jewish traditions, the the Hindu traditions, the Native American traditions, all of these different traditions all point to kind of the same thing. But what is that what we're pointing to? Right. And I think that's an important exploration for all of us to have in our own ways.
And that's my sort of expertise, if I have one, right, is looking at, all of our traditions are pointing at exactly that thing. And they all say, you can't name it. You can't describe it. You will never be able to understand the immensity, the wholeness of this. And that's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And it's one of the things, that's where it brings you back into that place of awe. Like, I'm never going to get this. My little silly pea brain is never going to figure this out. But that's okay, because you can still experience it. You don't have to understand it to experience it. And all the mystics will tell you that from across traditions. And you bring up a really interesting point, that we have an innate urge to want to know. We're scratching, like, why? How does this happen? That's just natural for us. And all of spirituality is about questions. It's not about the answers. Religion sometimes can say, here are the answers, right? Here's the doctrine. Here's the dogma. Here's what we believe, and you need to believe that. And if you don't, and a lot of people go, that's not really flying for me, I have other questions, then that certainty breaks open. And then you're in the mystery. And that's a far out place to be.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on a number of years ago when I was teaching as a graduate student? I had to teach a wellness class, and I was teaching about the dimensions of wellness, spirit, what we call SPIES on my other podcast, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. And I had a student raise his hand and say, I don't believe there's a spiritual dimension because I'm an atheist. How would you have responded to that student?
So I have a really dear friend who's a hardcore atheist, right? So, and we get into these little sparring contests all the time. And the way I answer that is, first of all, atheism, if you actually look at the word, means no deity, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a thing. I'm a hospice chaplain, and I had a patient who I only got to see him once, regrettably, but we had this amazing conversation. He was a former philosophy professor. And I walked in and he's like, oh, good, I'm glad you're here. Sit down. Didn't even look up from his computer. He was typing away, right? So I sit down, and then he turns to me in this very professorly way. And he says, do space and time exist? And I was like, I don't know. What do you think? And he said, no, they don't. They are the underlying fabric of everything. And I said, all right, I can go with that. And he said, but you and I exist because we are distinctions from that fabric. And I was like, okay, I'll go with that too. And then he said, but when we don't exist, we just go back into space and time. And I was like, you all right with that? And he said, maybe. And we got into a whole conversation because he was a lifelong atheist. And I said, the way that you are describing the physical fabric of the universe, of space and time, is the same way that God is described, or ultimate reality, or the Tao, or the source. It's the same thing. And he went, wow, maybe I'm not an atheist, And I think the way that I look at atheism is that oftentimes it is a belief that there is nothing underneath all of this. It's kind of, there's a nihilism in it. It's just this, you come together as a group of cells, you live your life, and then you die. I'm like, well, that sounds kind of meaningless, And you don't have to believe in a deity. You can believe in space and time. You can believe in, it doesn't matter, right? But if you have Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who is one of the great sort of interfaith, interspiritual teachers and leaders, he calls it the happening that is happening in all happenings. It's a verb, not a noun. So if you're an atheist, it could be, you have to get people to define it. Like, does that mean you don't believe in a thing called God or whatever? Then what do you believe in? And oftentimes it's actually a spiritual understanding, but they don't want to admit that.
Yeah. And maybe it's just an awkward word for us to use, but I don't think we have a better word to describe what is the spiritual. And I think that's been a problem, is that we have associated it with religion. And even when people say, well, I'm a spiritual person, but I'm not religious,
Right.
they're still kind of expressing it from a more religious standpoint.
Well, you think about what does it mean to be religious, right? And I think that we've gotten into our minds that it means you follow a particular doctrine, right? And you're in a box. But religiosity is a belief in something sacred.
Yeah.
That's all it is. Religiosity, right? Religion, you have to have, there's certain criteria to make something defined as a religion, rituals, doctrine, a community, all of that stuff. But if you have an orientation in some way, or even an inkling, a sense, you don't have to even be able to name it. And most people can't. They can't really name it because putting words to the ineffable is, an exercise in futility. It's really hard to name. But if you have some sense that there is something, and again, maybe it's not a thing, we just don't have, language is so inadequate, then I would call that actually religious. But we call it spiritual because people get freaked out by the word religious. It shocks me sometimes, when people will ask me, are you religious? And my answer is, yeah, I actually am. I actually do believe that there is this sacred that is so much more incomprehensible than I can even not comprehend. And that sends me to my knees. That would make me religious. Do I worship it? Do I bow down to it? No. Do I stand in front of it in awe? Yes. And if you go back into the Bible, people weren't worshiping initially, right? Their initial contact with that sacred was awe. Moses with the burning bush, whoa, step back. I can't even look at it.
Yeah.
It's that it's not building all these rituals of turning it into a deity.
Yeah, I love that in the Judeo-Christian traditions, there's really two definitions or two words for God. And it's like, I am and love. Right. And both of those are, again, bigger than self, and they're more actions and all-inclusive, not something narrowed down to some white-haired male sitting on a throne, with, lightning bolts flashing around him.
Right. And, the I am is existence, is life.
Yeah.
That's it. And, they are both verbs. It's just that it's so hard for us to talk about something unless we make it a thing. And we have, the personifying of God, like the dude with the, with the lightning bolts, we've done it historically forever and ever. Like, that's what humans do, is like, in order to understand something, we actually make it smaller. We make it into a thing because it's really hard to talk about or understand something that's not a thing. Love, let's take love. Like, if you can do a whole podcast on people's descriptions of love, right?
Yeah.
This is different. It's what we can sense, but sense doesn't always translate into words. And I go with the sense part. And I feel like that's why your initial question is actually really a hard question, because it forces me to put into language that which really isn't language for me. It's that which sends me to my knees in awe.
Which we know any atheist or any person of deep religious conviction is going to be knocked to their knees in awe of something.
Something, right? And that's, that's why I say, even if you call yourself an atheist, it's like, okay, what sends you to your knees? Where do you hit that place of wonder and mystery? And if you don't allow yourself to go there, I think it's like you're cutting off part of the spectrum of life, Sometimes I go outside, and I live on a farm that has like a full open sky. And so winter nights are particularly clear, and I can go outside, I can see the Milky Way. I see, thousands and thousands of stars. And, this is not an unusual thing, but I look at that and I go, wow, I can't even really comprehend that I'm looking into 3-dimensional space, that I can be looking back into the origins of this universe. And to contrast my whoa, with my son, who is an astrophysicist, and what he studies is the origins of the universe. And he will not let me say, there's a fine line here. He's like, don't go all woo on me, Mom, But I'm like, at what point is it wow for you? When we get too rational, then we lose that wow. We lose the magic.
Yeah.
And
I think that's why I gravitated to exercise physiology as a field, because there's just too much of a wow factor in that for me. It's like, how does this whole human existence, not only how does it function, but why does it function, and why does it function the way that it does? And just the more I dive deeper into it, then you start crossing the bounds of quantum physics and spirituality. So
and see, it's always a question. It's like when kids are little and it's always why, and you're like, I don't know. You finally get to that point. I don't know. Go ask Google. You're like, I don't know.
We don't want kids asking Google.
No, I know. But it's like, okay, you've reached the end of my knowledge as your parent. But it's sitting in that mystery, allowing ourselves to be awed.
Yeah.
And that takes humility. It takes a tremendous amount of humility to be able to just say, I don't know. And I'm good with that. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. So in our previous conversation, you were talking and you kind of made a comment that inspired this particular podcast when you said, we don't have this particular problem. We have a spiritual problem. And again, that's what we're addressing in this podcast, or what we hope to continue to address in this podcast. So when you hear the phrase, we have a spiritual problem, what does that mean to you?
So I think what I had said before was, we don't have an economic problem. We don't have a political problem. We don't have a social problem. We don't have an environmental problem. We have a spiritual problem. And the spiritual problem is that we have forgotten the sacred, that relationship to the sacred. Because if you don't have sense that there is something, and maybe it's not a thing. For me, it's not a thing. It's not a deity in the sense of it's a thing. It's a process. And I think of God, if you want to call it God, right, for simplification, as the process of all processes. Of a relationship to the sacred, you can desecrate. And that's what we're doing. Because it's not sacred. If all of life, if other people, if the planet that we live on is sacred to you, you're not going to destroy it. You're not going to hurt it. And so that's why I think we have a spiritual problem. We've gotten too rational. We have forgotten the awe, the wonder, the mystery of whoa, we're here for a blip and then we're gone. Sometimes this is when I lose words. I just go, and we need to rekindle, rebuild, rediscover our relationship to the sacred. And again, I'm not defining it. I know what it is for myself. But without that, then we have the other problems. So at the root, it's a spiritual problem. We look back at indigenous religions and we kind of, indigenous communities, and we romanticize it a little bit. I mean, a lot sometimes. But the reality is that they had a connection to life as sacred. Desecrated. And that's where we're holding up as our model of going back to indigenous relationship to the earth and things like that, because they had that relationship.
So how else do you see connections between spirituality or lack thereof in issues like mental health, social isolation, the polarization that we see in our communities today?
Well, those are 3 different questions, right? I do. And, there's a lot of research pointing to this, that mental health issues are often about not having some relationship to something that takes you outside of yourself. a lot of times mental health issues, like you get very narrow and very focused on yourself, right? And the anxieties and the depression and whatever. And this is why AA, 12-step spirituality, is all about the higher power. Like, we got to get you out of your self-centeredness, your self-concern, and realizing there's something else at work here. And for mental health, always, like, when we get out of ourselves, and that might be through a spiritual practice, through taking, caring for other people, serving others. When we get out of ourselves, we start to feel better, always. So that was mental health. What was the second one?
Was it social isolation?
Same thing, right? Narrowness versus expansiveness. Narrowness. Our social isolation, we're living in fear of each other. The pandemic didn't help that.
No.
So, we live in fear, we close in, we get narrower and narrower. And I also feel like, and this is a spiritual principle, if we recognize the divine in ourselves, then we will recognize it in other people. And I feel like, just even for myself, like when I am in that space, I am much more open to others, And this takes us to the next one, the divisiveness, right? The polarization. Again, narrow versus expansive versus, the divine is a both and. If it's inclusive and expansive and it's everything and everywhere, I feel like if we can come to the both and say, this too, that's one of the words, acceptance, this too. I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it. But it exists, so this too. This is God too.
So let's begin with acceptance, and let's plug your book a little bit, because I'm actually in the process right now going through the 10 words and meditating on those on a weekly basis. So right now up to benevolence. But tell us about the book, the 10 words, and how they're kind of important to this question that we're asking about. We have a spiritual problem.
Yeah, well, they really came out of my attempt to answer, like, okay, if we have a spiritual problem, how do we fix it? And, the book 10 Words, an Interspiritual Guide to Becoming Better People in a Better World, is based on these 10 spiritual principles, 10 single words. And we know these words, they're not difficult words. In fact, we've been trying to do this for millennia. But these are the words or the principles that are common no matter what faith or wisdom tradition we're talking about, from indigenous to Wiccan, right? Even if you're an atheist, I like to say we can cover it from A to Z, atheism to Zoroastrianism, right? These words are principles that apply, and they also apply in science, they apply in psychology. So the way I look at it, if we are trying to, because you asked, what is it? How are we evolving, right? How are we trying to become better people, right? Which is, these principles are what allow us to do that. And they all begin with A, B, and C. They're that basic. They're really that basic. Doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. It's work that you'll be doing your whole life. And the amazing thing about these words is they show up every day. Once you get them in your head, you're like, oh, here it is. Here's acceptance again. I thought I was accepting it, but here I'm not, And they help us cultivate certain qualities, ways of being and behaving in the world that will, I think, help. I'm not promising nirvana, enlightenment, you're going to go to heaven or anything, but I think, it's not so much I know that if you practice these words, you will be healthier, happier, more joyful, have, more of a sense of purpose, get along better with other people, and live in a world that feels more fulfilling and not fearful and scary.
So run through those 10 words for our listeners and viewers. First one's acceptance.
Nope. First one's attention.
Oh, attention. That's right. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, the first one's attention. And this is really interesting because in modern spirituality, attention or mindfulness is like the be all end all. Like, it stops there. I'm like, no, it's just the first word. And every spiritual practice ever is training you to pay attention, right? Because otherwise you're going through life and you're missing it. You're missing all of that wow. If you're paying attention, you're going to see the wow. But if you're not, or you're paying attention to things that are distracting you from it, or worse, harming you, which we can do where our attention is, right? So the first word is attention. Learning to pay attention, or give attention, or offer attention. The second word is acceptance, right? How do we, one thing that we can all agree on is the world is what it is, right? We don't have to like it. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to say, yes, this is all good, because sometimes it's not, sometimes it sucks, but you have to accept that too. The third word is authenticity, right? Which, is a little bit tricky, because what does authenticity really mean? Really, it's about honesty, truthfulness, and that isn't just about I'm not lying. It's about finding your own nature and doing that. My teacher used to say, you do you, baby, and let the Tao do the rest. You need to know who you are, though. If you're trying to be somebody else, you're not going to be happy. Going back to psychology, there's a lot of research out there that really some forms of depression are really about an unconscious understanding of not living authentically to yourself. So that's the third word. Fourth word, benevolence, or well-wishing, kindness, just basic kindness, right? The fifth word is balance. Everything, and this is a principle that shows up, really in nature. If you go out into a forest, there's a balance happening, but balance doesn't mean it's all equal. Some trees get more sunlight, right? But there's a harmony. So balance is really more, it's not about always being equal and in balance. It's about all those, as an exercise physiologist, it's all those micro adjustments that you're making in your body all the time. Well, that's true in the world. To stay in balance, it's a series of micro adjustments. The sixth word is contemplation, which is the fulcrum between inner. So these first five words are really I'm working on myself here. I'm cultivating certain things. But then contemplation is where you start to go, oh, wait a minute, there's something more than me, right? And then the seventh word is creativity. The universe is inherently creative, and so are we. Everything we do, from every breath we take, is a creative act. It's putting something into the world that didn't exist before, right? So and then with creativity comes the responsibility. If we are creating in every moment, all the time, with our thoughts, our words, our actions, our breath, we have a responsibility for that creation. The eighth word is collaboration. The universe is inherently collaborative, right? That's how things work. If we're just competing, conquering, controlling, it doesn't work very well, right? The ninth word is celebration, right? That's the joy. That's the whoa, it's the gratitude. It's the, we're here and this is here. Hooray. We get to be alive. Thank you. And then the 10th word is care, right? It is only through acts of care that we survive. Even in the animal world, you'll see that. Even in a forest, again, I go back to a forest, trees will take care of each other. If there's a sick tree, they're sending signals through the mycelial web. Who knew? Yeah. Right? But it's a circle, because to care for something or someone means to attend to it. You're giving it your attention. So attention is an act of care. And here we go, right? So the first 5 words, really working on yourself. 6th word, okay, there's something else, right? My little triangle. There's self, sacred, other, right? They're all connected. And then the last words are about other. How am I out in the world in relationship to other people, other beings?
Cyclical nature of the 10 words with care, coming back to attention. And we've had this conversation already, that it kind of brings me to what I call the well-centered fitness. Again, the spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social being a bit more of an asymptote, that when we're well-centered, we're getting closer and closer to that target. The target keeps getting smaller. We're never getting to perfection, but we're always moving closer and closer to it. And yeah, sometimes we're going to move back out of the way, but we're going to keep trying to get closer and closer to that perfection. And to me, that is the spiritual. And again, it doesn't require religiosity or God or any of that kind of stuff. It's just a human desire to be our best today, to be better tomorrow, and just keep progressing toward a greater humanity.
Yeah, or the way I look at it, it's like, we have kind of two purposes, two things. One is like, enjoy the heck out of it. Again, I'm a hospice chaplain. I spend a lot of time with people at the end. This is a short ride. Yeah. Enjoy it, right? Be grateful for that. And while you're here, try to leave the campground in better condition than you found it. If it's possible, don't make a huge mess out of things. We're all going to make a mess because we're human, right? We're all going to, I don't know that there is perfection. There's always just a process, right? Yeah. And sometimes, sometimes we make a mess out of it, and that's okay. And we have to forgive ourselves and accept that and have self-compassion. And that's just part of the journey. You are whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you are. There's nothing else you can be.
So I'm going to go to one of the words. And again, like I said, I'm taking a week and kind of meditating and reflecting on each of these words. And this week, as I was kind of going through the process of looking at benevolence, I looked for some quotes to kind of point me in the right direction. And I came across one by Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he says that I'm going to have to read it here. Every account of a higher power that I've ever seen described, of all religions that I've seen, include many statements with regard to the benevolence of that power. When I look at the universe and all the ways the universe wants to kill us, I find it hard to reconcile that statement of benevolence.
Well, this too, right? Yeah. This too, that there is, nothing happens without creation and destruction. That's the cycle. These are the patterns, right? There is always the good, the bad. There's always life and death, right? Everything works this way. So you can focus on all the ways that the universe is trying to kill us, or you can focus on all the ways that's like, whoosh, I'm still here, And I actually, Neil deGrasse Tyson and I would disagree. I actually think that the universe is, on the whole, more benevolent than it is destructive. Oh yeah, there are a ton of ways that, we can be killed. That's just all part of the process, though. But the fact that there's life, that life continues, that life is, that the universe is expanding and creating new life, new planets, new stars, new whatever, all the time. That's benevolent. Yeah. For me, like, the source of life is going, live, go, thrive. I've just made you go do you. I think that's the greatest benevolent gift ever. And sometimes the universe has to whack you down a little bit and say, yeah, no, you need to calm it down, but that's part of it. So again, the universe being, or God, or whatever you want to call it, the both and. I'm not going to focus on the ways the universe is trying to kill me. I'm going to focus on the fact that I woke up this morning. Yay! Bonus day.
Well, I just had the thought of, Nietzsche's famous quote of, that which does not kill me makes me stronger. I mean, I think that there's a benevolence, and I want to call it a God because that's where my belief system is. I believe that God allows for this. He doesn't. If He gave us a perfect creation where there was not the stressors in life, there'd be no growth. Yawn. Growth requires that there be that tension, that there be difficulties, that there be that somewhat imbalance at times that's going to cause greater growth.
Yeah.
Even if you think of from, evolution of our geography, that there wouldn't be these beautiful mountains and, canyons and things like that if there wasn't tension and destruction in the world, if there
Right.
weren't and rivers and everything.
That's what I mean. Like, you have to have both. That is the process of lifing, or godding. Like, it's got both. There is no such thing as perpetual, creation. It would be crazy. Like, if you can imagine, like, it's just this constant creation and nothing ever ends. Yeah. And the idea that I think we're mistaken in our spirituality in some ways, that spirituality is supposed to just make it all, like, it's all good, it's all even, it's all just, everything's just hunky-dory all the time. And, Adyashanti, who's a Advaita Vedanta teacher, one of my first teachers years ago, his definition of enlightenment, or what he used to say, was, it's the end of your world. So you get the understanding, but certain things are going to have to go. Right. And one of the things that is going to have to go is a magical thinking belief that if you just do this, it's all going to be perfect all the time. It doesn't work that way. That's just not how our universe works.
I wouldn't want it to be perfect all the time.
Oh my God, it would be so boring. Yeah. Like, we need, my mother, when I was a kid, my mother used to say to me, Lauren, you can't live at the top of the EKG. Cause I was like, I wanted all the excitement all the time. And she's like, you can't live there. And I said, why not? And she said, because it's a flat line.
That's a great perspective.
Life has its ups and downs. That's part of the way, there's cosmic scale and there's short scale. There are species of bugs that don't even live a day. Boy, do they live an intense day, but they don't live, And then there's galaxies that take millions and millions of years. So this goes back to what you were saying about scale before, from the smallest to the largest. And it's all of that.
Yeah, the more I'm going to explore spirituality, the more I think I'm just going to be in awe of what I don't know and what I need to learn and how I need to grow and all those types of things.
That's been my journey, right? To get to that place that I didn't even know that's where I needed to get to. And I think a lot of people start a spiritual journey like, I don't even really know what I'm looking for, or I can't articulate it. And I wouldn't have told you when I started my spiritual journey in my teens that, like, this was what I was going for. But getting to that place of spending more time in the wow, in the awe, and where else am I gonna go? Where else can you go from there? I don't know. We'll see. Maybe that's when you dissolve and, like, join the one. Like, I don't know. But I think that's what all the mystics point to, is that dissolution of self into the all, which is a place of great mystery and awe. They all point to that.
And that's one of the biggest challenges I have as a Christian. And I prefer to kind of call myself more of a follower of Christ. Mm-hmm. And, I can explore that in so many different ways. But when I think of Christianity, especially as we look at some of the more evangelical traditions, where it's like being born again, being saved, and, once you accept Christ, you're saved. Well, where's the end of that? And where is the responsibility for me to become more and to kind of share that? I feel like oftentimes Christianity, in a very isolated perspective, can be too self-centered. Mm-hmm. It's about me, my salvation.
Right.
And I love the verse where Christ says, the people say, or he says to the people, why do you call me Lord, Lord? I don't know you. Say that, we did this and all this in your name. And he's like, who are you? I don't know you. Yeah. That to me is one of the scariest verses in the Bible, because it's like, there's this chance that I can be doing everything that I'm told to do and I think to be right, and in the end, it's wrong. And that kind of scares the bejeebers out of me. It's like,
you're not
how
alone.
Am I living my life?
Right. You're not alone in that. I mean, again, going back to spending time with people at the end of life, sometimes that's a question. Like, did I do this right? Am I going to go to heaven? Because that's what I was promised. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think? I can't tell you, you know? And I think that this is where, you know, we have to take responsibility. We have to have our own relationship to whatever we call sacred. We have to take responsibility for who we are. Nobody else, Christ or the Buddha or anybody, is going to be like, swish, now you're all good.
Yeah.
That's kind of magical thinking, you know? It's on us. It's really on us. And, you know, one of my favorite quotes is, it's actually a mashup. Again, Rami Shapiro, who, one of my favorites. It's a mashup between a quote from Micah and the Pirkei Avot, which are the sayings, the teachings of the rabbis. And the quote is this: do not be daunted by the world's grief. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but you're not free to abandon it either. Right? So what's the work? Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. How do you do that? Try the 10 words, right? Like, but that's the work, right? That is the work. And we're never going to complete it. It's built into that saying, you're not going to complete it, but you can't not do it either. And then you have to figure out what those mean. What does it mean? And that's why I say we have a spiritual problem, because until you understand what, you know, what it means to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly. And the Micah quote is walk humbly with your God. Now means in this moment, every moment. Until you figure out what those mean for yourself, nobody can tell you that. Wow.
I know. As I edit this podcast, I'm going to end up so many times having to just kind of edit out some of those long pauses, because I'm just going to sit in this moment of wow. So often it's like, okay, where do I go next in this? Because that was just such a profound statement.
Right. I mean, to me, that's the everything, right? And a big part of the 10 words was, all right, how do I do that? How do I do that without putting myself into a box? Because I don't think, you know, all of our faith and wisdom traditions have gems of wisdom, all of them. Some parts, once they get institutionalized and doctrine and dogma and all of that, not so great. But the wisdom parts of that is what, like, how do I know this is what I'm supposed to do, right? It's what we're supposed to do. Like, just be decent human beings. My teacher, who was Taoist abbot, used to say, just don't be a jerk. Great. How do I not be a jerk? Well, here are 10 words. You know, if we put these principles into practice, you won't be a jerk.
Yeah.
You can't be. And that's the thing, you know, going back to the title of this podcast, which I love, right? And I feel so honored to, you know, have been part of its genesis, is that our spirit, if we did these things, if we found our connection back to the sacred, we wouldn't be able to. It would be impossible to do the things that we're doing that are causing the problems. It would just be impossible.
Yeah.
And then I was on another podcast last week, and the interviewer was asking me, well, like, okay, if you're in this wow all the time, like, what's that going to do to your productivity? I'm like, okay, is productivity the point?
Good point.
You know, like, is that the point of life? No, it's really hard if you're crawling around on your knees going, whoa, look at these bugs, you know, or wow, look at the sky. Like, yeah, you're not going to be super productive, which is why the mystics, you know, like, just go out into the desert and do that. But that doesn't mean that we can't have an orientation that's that way.
And I think we can be in the wow in our productivity.
Point.
You know, I lecture, you know, at least 4 days a week as a college professor, and there are so many times in my classes that, you know, I drift away from teaching from the textbook and all these bullet point kind of things, because, you know, as I tell my students, it's like everything that we do in exercise science is biomechanical, psychosocial, and you can't disconnect those four things. And somewhere in there too is the spiritual. And we get off on some tangents where it's like, wow, this is just, I mean, how awesome is this? And
Right. I was just going to say, awesome. Wow.
yeah,
That's great.
I can't teach without being in the wow. And if I'm not in the wow, then why am I teaching what I'm teaching?
Right.
What's my classes?
And that's what I mean is like, if we have an orientation towards the wow, it's going to show up in everything we do.
Yeah.
You know,
and even in your productivity, you know, what are you doing career-wise? And if it's not giving you that wow, why is that a career or vocation? You know, it's like you're a construction worker, you're building a house. How can you not be in the wow of building a house? I mean, I put these nails and these boards together and I've created something. I can stand back at the end of a day and there is something that wasn't there a moment ago.
Right. So there's that word, creativity. And that's the thing is these words are going to show up. They're going to show up and they are how, you know, they are an orientation. They're a way of bringing you back to, you know, because it's really easy to go off into all kinds of weird, you know, when you're in the spiritual world, you all kinds of weird, right? And they just bring you back to what matters, you know, what matters. What helps us become better people in a better world? What helps us live lives of peace and joy and purpose? That's
and I think that's where people kind of get off on the wrong direction when they talk spirituality, is that they neglect the idea that there's a center in the spirituality. And the center isn't us per se. We personally have to be centered, but we're centered as an orientation toward others, toward the outer. And that's important to remember, that it's not just kind of dancing around in la la land. It's, oh, I'm spiritual. I feel, you know, I just feel, you know, yeah, it's great to feel, but what are you feeling for?
Right. And even, you know, I mean, I call a lot of that stuff kind of the magic tricks. People just get into the magic tricks like, oh, look, I've got this exotic new practice, or, you know, not to belittle crystals, but, you know, my crystals are talking to me or whatever, you know, like that's still going back to that self-centeredness. It's my practice and my experience and my feel, and I feel all good, right? That is not the point of spirituality. The point of spirituality is your relationship between yourself, the sacred, and others. That is the point. So even Buddhism, you know, American Buddhism has gotten very much about, you know, my meditation practice and whatever. It's like, no, in Buddhism, it's like, may the fruits of my practice benefit others. That is the whole point. You know, a bodhisattva denies their own entrance into nirvana to stay to help others to relieve their suffering. This is not self-centered. So we have to come back to remembering it's about our relationship to the world around us. And who are we and how do we behave in that, in relationship to that sacred?
Again, one of those wow moments where I just have to pause and think for a moment. So that leads me kind of to the question, you know, are there ways to bridge the divides between people with different spiritual and philosophical perspectives to work toward shared goals?
Well, yeah, first of all, it takes an openness, right? Like if you believe you have all the answers, it's going to be really hard, right? And I think it's coming to what are the shared goals. And I think ultimately, I mean, if we look at our polarized world right now, it's coming back to what's the common ground, right? What's the common ground? I'm going to bet that 99% of most people in the world just kind of want to live their lives in peace with their families, you know, have food on their table, a roof over their heads, you know, opportunities for gathering together, joy, you know, purpose, creativity. That's all people want, really. So anything that's in the way of that is what we have to look at. You know, like am I holding on to some belief or idea or vision of how I think the world should be, and you're in the way of that? That's not a really good approach. I think it's about openness. I think it's really about, you have to be willing to put aside This is where benevolence comes in, right? You need to be able to put aside your own stuff for the wishing well and the kindness towards others. And if we don't do that, if we're going to hold on to, this is the hill I'm going to die on with my flag, great. What do you want on your epitaph? Like if we're going to hold on to stuff in acceptance, collaboration, all these words are going to come up, care. If you're going to hold on to your beliefs and your ideas till death, then okay, that's your choice. Or if you're going to go, you know what? Why do I believe do I really believe this? Is this that important? Is my need to have my stuff, which is fear, right? If somebody's going to take my stuff or somebody's going to get what I want. And, this belief, this goes to benevolence, right? This belief in there's only a limited amount. No, how does your success diminish mine? There's no way that could happen because there's not a limited portion of it. The benevolence of the universe is overflowing.
So what do you see as some of the biggest obstacles in addressing these spiritual and existential issues in the world?
I think we've gotten really rational. We believe that I was actually just writing about this because I've been writing a piece on acceptance. I did a book event a couple of weeks ago where we were talking, okay, what word's up for you guys? And it was acceptance. It's always like the one that comes up, right? Because it's really hard. To accept something, do you have to understand it? And the answer is not necessarily. There are lots of things we accept that we don't understand. I cannot tell you really how nuclear fission, fusion, whatever the sun is, right?
Both of them are hard to understand.
I don't understand that. But I do accept that the sun is in the sky burning.
Yeah.
For now. That's great. So I think that we've just gotten too rational and we feel like, in the age of information, we have to have so much information and we need all this information. We have to prove it. And, science, which is a belief system, just saying, right? It's science, not, faith. That faith has been really maligned in the age of rationalism. Like, oh, how can you believe something that you don't understand? Well, I do, you exist. I believe you exist. Do you understand that? Because I don't. I think we have to just step back from needing to have the answers and needing to have, certainty and facts. And I'm not saying blindly, stupidly. I'm just saying that we need to realize that if we're going to solve these problems, we have to expand. And in that expansion, we're going to come up against things that we don't know. And that's okay. We have to trust. We have to trust that what we're doing isn't, we have to trust that what we're doing is helping in some way, and that we're part of something so much bigger than we are. We forget we're on our little lifetime timeline and we forget about cosmic time and we think it has to be this way. It's like, well, you don't know, 10,000 years from now, like, a friend of mine was saying that maybe he was talking about, the environmental, the carbon, in the sky, in the air. And he was saying, maybe we are being used by God to put more carbon into the environment because when you have an explosion of carbon, you have more life. And I was like, well, that's an interesting thought, right? We don't know.
Fire up my car right now.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not saying that go ahead and, but maybe it's the same way like Michael Pollan in his book about, desire, he was talking about how the, apples used us to spread, right? Or think about how burrs stick to your clothes when you're out in the forest and they go, great, I'm going over there to propagate. We don't know. We don't know. There's so much more going on than we understand.
Again, one of those long pauses to reflect and to think on that. Wow. So what's one piece of wisdom or insight from your own life or work that you believe can help others to address the spiritual challenges?
Be open. Be open to wow. Be open to not knowing. I used to be one of those people who's like, I knew, I'm a hardcore book person and I read a lot and I know all the facts and I have all these multiple degrees. And I was like, I know. And the more I know, the more I know I don't know. And I love being in that space. I don't feel like I have to know because I know I'm on a need to know basis, but I will. The more I learn, the more it just makes me go, wow. I had a friend several years ago who unfortunately had a stroke. And during the period of aphasia, when she couldn't really speak or understand words, she could only say 2 words, the F word and wow. And she would say them. She would just be gazing around and say these 2 words in all these various different permutations. I mean, you can imagine, right? And everybody was all worried. And I was like, no, this is brilliant. This is so brilliant because really, like, what else do you need to say? Because sometimes it's like the F word and sometimes it's wow. The only other thing I could say, the only other thing that you might want to add in there is thank you. Thank you. And maybe there's a 4th word, which is maybe, I don't know.
I think I got to end this conversation today on that note. It's like, just fuck, wow, maybe, thank you. Those are the words that we can go through today. There's going to be moments that, we're going to say fuck, and then we're going to, but wow, Right. And we got to be grateful. And that's where, I love to add the extra T in gratitude and having an attitude of gratitude. Mm. And so, as we wrap up today and as the listeners take this away, and I hope they'll contemplate all that you have given them today. I think today has been a great gift for me. Mm-hmm. And if it's a gift for me, then it's a gift for everybody else. Just take this information, ponder it, and we'll be back with more episodes of this. And most certainly, Lauryn, you will be back on this podcast regularly because I just love your perspective on the spiritual and just on life itself. And so you'll be back. And I just thank you for joining us today, and just keep doing what you're doing, and, just go out and wow the fuck out of it. And now I've just narrowed my audience with those words.
I mean, but it's true, like whether we say it or not. And thank you so much. Really, it's always a pleasure to talk with you and dive deeper into this thing we call life and how do we do it. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you again whenever that happens.
Well, we're looking forward to having you back.